My life changed forever the day I tried to surprise my son. What began as a simple act of love turned into the most terrifying discovery a mother could imagine. Hidden in the back of his car, I overheard a conversation that revealed a chilling plan for my death. The people I trusted most, my own family, had decided that my life was worth nothing more than money and property. But instead of falling into their trap, I chose to outsmart them in a way they never expected. What followed was a journey of betrayal, suspense, and a shocking resurrection that the world would never forget. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Now let me take you back to the moment when it all began. I still remember that afternoon with unsettling clarity. The sun was beginning to dip behind the towers of the city, washing the streets in a dull orange light that felt heavier than it should have. My intention had been simple, almost childlike. I had cooked Marco's favorite stew, the same recipe I used to make when he was a boy, and I wanted to surprise him at his office. It was nothing more than a small gesture of love, a way to remind him that no matter how grown and successful he had become, he was still my son, the center of my world. With the warm container balanced carefully in my hands, I drove toward the underground parking garage beneath the building where he worked. As I pulled in, I noticed his sleek black SUV parked near the far wall. It stood out even in the dimness, polished and proud, a symbol of the life he had built for himself. I remember smiling at the sight of it, thinking how proud his father would have been to see him now. That was when a mischievous idea flickered in my mind. What if I waited for him inside the car, hidden in the back seat, and surprised him when he opened the door? The thought made me laugh softly to myself. It was a silly plan, the kind of thing a mother might do for a child, not for a grown man, but I longed for that playful connection again. Without thinking too much about it, I walked over and tugged at the door handle. To my relief, it opened without resistance. The air inside smelled faintly of leather and cologne, a sharp reminder of Marco's carefully curated life. I crouched down, careful not to spill the food, and slid into the back seat. My heart beat quickly, not with fear but with anticipation. I pictured his startled laugh when I jumped up, the way his face would soften when he realized it was me. I clutched the container to my chest and leaned forward against the back of the driver's seat, listening to the echo of footsteps in the garage. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional hum of cars pulling in and out. Every sound seemed amplified, each echo bouncing against the concrete walls. I forced myself to breathe quietly, my nerves tingling with the thrill of the surprise. Minutes passed before I finally heard them, distinct footsteps, a pair of voices drawing closer. The driver's door opened, and Marco slid into the seat, his movements brisk and tired. I almost rose, then ready to reveal myself, but something stopped me. Another door opened, the passenger side this time, and someone else got in. The voice that followed was unmistakable. Isabella, my daughter-in-law. She was speaking in a tone I had never quite heard before, sharper and colder than the polite words she usually offered me. My smile faltered as I listened, unease, prickling along the edges of my thoughts. "Are you certain no one will suspect anything when it happens?" she asked quietly, her voice echoing in the confined space. I frowned, confused, not yet grasping the meaning. Marco's reply came quickly, calm but carrying an edge that made my stomach tighten. "We have been over this, Isabella. The plan is perfect. It will look like nothing more than a tragic accident. No one questions it when an older woman slips from a balcony." The words struck me like a physical blow. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping aloud. My son, my only child, was speaking of an accident. An accident meant for me. I felt the blood drain from my face, my body shrinking into the shadows of the seat as I struggled to believe what I had heard. They continued without pause, their conversation flowing with a dreadful casualness that left me trembling. Isabella leaned closer, her voice filled with a strange excitement. "Once everything is settled, we can finally sell that house of hers. That view alone will bring in a fortune. With the money from the sale, the savings she has tucked away, and her insurance, we will finally be free of all this stress." My hands began to shake, the container of stew trembling in my lap. That house she spoke of with such cold calculation was more than property. It was the home I had built out of sacrifice, the place filled with memories of laughter, tears, and countless nights spent, ensuring Marco had a better future. Every corner held a piece of my life, yet to them it was nothing more than a prize to be claimed. Marco's voice followed, steady but void of warmth. Tomas and Lucia are ready. Tomas knows we need this, and Lucia has never forgiven my mother for keeping everything to herself. They will not stand in our way. Hearing those names, my brother and his wife sent another knife through my chest. Family conspiring, with family weaving a plot to end my life as if it were business. I pressed my forehead against the seat in front of me, the fabric rough against my skin, my tears beginning to fall silently. "Everything will be quick," Isabella added firmly. "And afterward no one will even think to question it. We will play the grieving children. We will look devastated. No one will ever imagine the truth." My body felt cold and heavy, each word burying me deeper in despair. How had it come to this? The boy I had raised with endless devotion, the man for whom I had sacrificed every joy of my own life, was calmly discussing my death as if it were a transaction. I wanted to scream, to leap from the shadows and confront them, but fear chained me in place. What if they discovered me then and there? What would they do to silence me? The car fell silent for a moment, the kind of silence that vibrates with unspoken meaning. Then Marco spoke again, his tone darker than ever. "The life insurance alone will give us 100,000. Add that to the property value, and we will finally be able to buy the house Isabella wants. No more sleepless nights. No more debt collectors." My vision blurred with tears, my chest aching as I fought to remain still. I realized then that the boy I had loved, the one I had nurtured through hardship and loneliness, no longer existed. In his place sat a stranger, a man willing to trade his mother's life for comfort and wealth. Eventually their conversation drifted to other details, arrangements for the days after, plans for appearances, even how they might explain my absence to the neighbors. Each word carved deeper wounds, but I forced myself to listen, to absorb every detail. If I were to survive, if I were to fight this betrayal, I needed to know everything. At last the doors opened again. Footsteps echoed away into the distance, leaving me alone in the heavy silence of the garage. I remained frozen, afraid to move until 10 long minutes had passed. When I finally emerged from the car, I felt as though I had aged years in that short span of time. The world outside seemed colder, crueler, a place where trust no longer existed. I stumbled back to my own car, the container of stew still clutched in my trembling hands, though I had no memory of carrying it. Driving home was like moving through a fog. My thoughts spun endlessly, replaying the conversation again and again, each repetition deepening the wound. I wanted to deny it, to convince myself I had misheard, but the words echoed too clearly. My son wanted me dead. When I reached my house by the sea, I collapsed into a chair, staring out at the waves crashing against the rocks below. That balcony, once my place of peace, had become the stage for my potential death in their eyes. The betrayal was unbearable, yet beneath the pain a spark of something else began to stir. I could not let them succeed. I could not surrender so easily to their plan. Still, the question haunted me. What could I do against them? Against the people who knew me so well, who had already plotted every detail? I sat there for hours as the daylight faded, my tears drying into lines of salt on my cheeks. That night, as the sea whispered its endless rhythm against the cliffs, I made a silent vow. If they wanted to take my life, they would discover that I was not so easy to destroy. I would find a way to protect myself, but first I needed to understand how my life had unraveled to this point. To grasp the depth of betrayal, I had to look back at where it all began. And that is where my story with Marco truly takes root. I could not sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless crash of the waves against the cliffs outside my window. My mind circled endlessly around the words I had heard in Marco's car. His voice, so calm and certain, repeated itself in my head like a cruel melody. I asked myself over and over how the boy I had carried in my arms, the boy I had shielded from hunger and loneliness, had become a man capable of planning his own mother's death. There was only one way to begin to understand. I had to look back, to retrace the path that had led us here step by step. Marco came into my life in the middle of hardship. I was barely 20 when he was born, and I was already married to Daniel, a miner who worked long hours underground. We lived in a tiny rented room in a crumbling neighborhood near the sea. There was never much money, but we had hope, and we believed that with enough work we could carve a better future. That dream was shattered when Daniel was killed in an accident at the mine. One morning he left for work with a kiss on my forehead, and that evening he did not return. The news came in the form of 2 men at my door, hats in their hands, their eyes filled with pity. I was widowed before my son had learned to read. There was no insurance, no savings, no nest egg to fall back on. The company paid a small compensation that barely lasted a few months. I was left with Marco, a toddler with wide eyes and a mountain of fear. But I refused to surrender. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I endured long enough, I could still give him a life better than the one I had known. So I began to work. At first it was cleaning houses, then sewing clothes for neighbors, then late-night tutoring for children who struggled in school. I woke before dawn, worked, until my hands ached, and fell asleep at my table with Marco curled against my side. Those were the years that shaped us both. I still remember the hunger gnawing at my stomach because I had given the last piece of bread to Marco. I remember the nights when he coughed with fever, and I stayed awake wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, praying he would not grow sicker because I could not afford a doctor. And I remember the first time I saw his eyes light up when he opened a book. He was clever, endlessly curious, and his teachers said he had a brilliant mind. That praise became my lifeline. If Marco could succeed, if he could study and build a different life, then every sacrifice would be worthwhile. When he was 15, he needed a computer for his schoolwork. It was far beyond what I could afford. Other parents bought them easily, but for me it meant months of work. I sold the last piece of jewelry I owned, a gold ring Daniel had given me on our wedding day. The pawnshop clerk weighed it in his hand without care, gave me a few bills, and I walked out with tears in my eyes. But when I handed Marco his new computer, his smile erased my pain. I never told him what it had cost me. I did not want him to feel guilty. It was my duty, my gift to him. By the time he finished high school, he had already decided to study law. The tuition was staggering, an impossible mountain for someone like me. I turned to my brother Tomas for help, hoping that family would stand by me. He listened to my plea, his face expressionless, and then he shook his head. He told me that Marco's dreams were foolish, that I should make him get a job and forget about such nonsense. His words were sharp, cruel, and they cut me deeply. But I did not let them stop me. If no one else believed in Marco, then I would carry the weight alone. I took on another job, cleaning a veterinary clinic at night after hours. My days began at 5 in the morning and ended near midnight. I worked 7 days a week, selling food on weekends, sewing in every spare moment. My body grew weary, my back ached, and my hands were raw from chemicals, but I endured. Marco's education became the beacon that kept me moving. I finally managed to save enough for his first year of college. When I accompanied him to the university to sign his enrollment papers, I cried with joy. His name on those documents felt like proof that my sacrifices had not been in vain. The years that followed were even harder, but I endured them willingly. I skipped meals, wore the same old clothes, and walked home in the rain to save bus fare, all so Marco would have books and a full stomach. I wanted him to blend in with the wealthy students who filled his classes, not to feel ashamed of where he came from. I thought I was building him a bridge to a better life. I did not realize I was building walls between us. During his 3rd year, he met Isabella. She was beautiful, polished, the daughter of a wealthy businessman. I worried at first, afraid that Marco would feel out of place in her world of luxury, but he seemed enchanted by her, and she treated him with the charm of someone raised to impress. Still, I felt her eyes on me when she visited my house. She looked at the peeling paint, the worn furniture, the simple meals I prepared, and though she smiled politely, her gaze was cold and judging. I pushed aside my unease. Marco was happy, and that was enough for me. After graduation, Marco found work at a prestigious law firm. His salary was more than I had ever earned in 3 months combined. I thought I could finally rest, finally let go of the endless struggle. But rest never came. He married Isabella in a lavish ceremony that drained the last of my savings. She insisted on grandeur, claiming it was only proper for their social standing. I paid the bills with shaking hands, telling myself it was worth it for his happiness. At the wedding, I overheard guests whispering about the groom's humble mother, their words laced with disdain. I swallowed the humiliation and smiled, refusing to let the bitterness stain the day. Afterward, Marco's visits grew fewer. Isabella always had excuses: business trips, family dinners with her parents, social gatherings that kept them busy. When they did visit, they spoke mostly of their expensive apartment, the restaurants they dined at, the plans for a bigger house. I listened quietly, nodding, though their world felt further and further from my own. By then I was in my 60s, my body too worn for endless work. I worked part-time and clung to the savings I had managed to gather, about $50,000 tucked away for emergencies. It was not wealth, it was survival. My relationship with Tomas had worsened over the years. He often mocked me, calling me lucky for having a successful son while his children stumbled through life. His wife Lucia was sharper, still accusing me of selfishness, of spending too much on Marco while ignoring the rest of the family. Their words stung, but I dismissed them as jealousy. I never imagined their resentment would one day twist into something darker. Looking back now, I see the signs I missed. 6 months before that terrible day in the garage, Marco and Isabella began speaking of buying a grand house in an exclusive neighborhood. The price was more than $500,000, an unimaginable sum to me. When I asked how they planned to pay for it, Marco brushed me off with vague comments about investments. Around the same time, their questions about my finances became more frequent. They asked about the value of my house, about my savings, about my insurance. I thought it was concern, a son checking that his mother was secure. I did not realize it was reconnaissance for my death. As I sat alone in my chair that night, staring at the balcony that overlooked the sea, all the pieces fell into place. Every sacrifice, every choice, every sleepless night had led to this bitter truth. The boy I had raised with love had chosen greed instead. My brother, who should have been my protector, had chosen resentment. Isabella, who should have been my daughter, had chosen cold ambition. They wanted me gone, and they had already rehearsed how to make it happen. But as despair closed in around me, something else stirred in my chest. It was faint at first, a flicker of the strength that had carried me through all those years of hardship. I realized that I had survived worse before, and I could survive this too. If they wanted me to have an accident, then I would make sure the accident was one of my own design. They would not destroy me so easily. And with that thought, I began to plan a move that would change everything. I had never felt more alone and more determined at the same time. The betrayal had hollowed me out, but it had also lit a fire I did not know I still carried. I needed an ally, someone I could trust without question, and there was only one person who fit that impossible description. Clara lived 2 houses down. She was a retired nurse with steady hands and a practical mind. We had shared coffee for 20 years and small kindnesses that never required explanation. When I went to her door at dusk, my palms were clammy and my voice trembled, but Clara opened the door without surprise. She had always known when something serious was wrong. I told Clara everything, starting with the chance hiding in Marco's car and ending with the cruel plans I had overheard. I did not spare a detail. Clara listened without interruption. Her face clouded with that mix of shock and fierce protection I had seen when a child scraped a knee. At the end, I asked the question I had rehearsed a dozen times. Could she help me fake my death in a way that would convince the paramedics and the officials? There was a long silence. Then she nodded slowly, and I felt my knees stop trembling. Clara and I spent the next days planning with the kind of focus that close friends learn to share. We mapped out every step, counting risks and contingencies as if we were staging an elaborate play. The goal was simple in description and dangerous in execution. I would simulate a sudden cardiac event. Clara would be there to administer precise medications that would slow my breathing and pulse to a level that might be mistaken for death by an inexperienced responder. The paramedics would be called, the body would go to the hospital, and a sympathetic pathologist would issue a death certificate. I would then wake in a hidden room in Clara's cellar while the world believed I was gone. To pull this off, we needed help beyond Clara's nursing skills. She reached out quietly to an old colleague, a pathologist named Dr. Velasco. He was not the sort of man to cause a scandal lightly, but his years in the mortuary had left him with an unusual sympathy for desperate causes. Clara explained the situation without melodrama. She described the recordings we needed to capture the danger I faced and the certainty that if I did not act, we would lose everything and perhaps more. Dr. Velasco agreed to assist on the condition that every action be controlled and that no one be put at needless risk. He promised to falsify the paperwork if the circumstances demanded it, but he warned us about legal consequences, and we accepted the risk as a price of survival. There was also the matter of the first responders. We needed the paramedic who would declare me dead to be cautious and somewhat inexperienced. Clara remembered a young man named Ruben who had recently started his rounds at the city ambulance service. He was earnest and quick to follow protocol, but he was new enough to make judgment calls without the hardened suspicion of veterans. Clara asked a favor of an old friend at the station. The friend agreed to dispatch Ruben to our call, phrasing the request as a neighborly check for an elderly woman found collapsed. It felt like weaving threads a fragile pattern of favors and trust. The night we chose was quiet and small. I wore the yellow dress I kept for special occasions, a bright color I had always loved. I wanted the scene to be dignified even if it was staged. Clara arrived with a small medical kit in a soft bag. She moved with a calm precision that steadied me. The medication she used was a carefully measured cocktail, one that would slow vital signs almost to disappearance without crossing the line to permanent harm if monitored correctly. I lay on the floor as she administered the doses. The room seemed to tilt as the medicine took hold. Sound grew distant like voices underwater. Clara murmured encouragement, and then she placed a hand on my wrist and checked for pulse until it became a gentle, nearly silent flutter. When the sirens arrived, the plan felt both too real and yet perfectly rehearsed. Clara told the dispatcher that she had found me unresponsive, and in her voice was the practiced grief of a professional playing a part for the greater good. Ruben and his partner moved swiftly. They took my vitals and followed their training. I was dimly aware of gloved hands, of flashlights, of a stifled conversation about signs of cardiac arrest. Clara guided them carefully, drawing attention away from the subtleties we feared would betray our ruse. After a few minutes that hung like hours, Ruben said the words we had hoped for with trembling precision. He declared me deceased. The hospital did what hospitals do. Nurses wrapped sheets, technicians moved with solemn efficiency, and I was placed on a gurney as if the world had ended. I felt nothing of that for a time. I drifted in a strange place between sleep and waking, while Clara followed behind, eyes bright with salt. She rode with me to the hospital as if she were a true mourner, and she stayed until the paperwork was completed. Then, under the cover of night and the hum of fluorescent corridors, Dr. Velasco signed the certificate that would proclaim me gone. The legal death of Elena Navarro was sealed with a quiet stamp on official paper. I woke hours later in a cool, dark room with the faint scent of damp earth and dust. My mouth was dry and my limbs heavy. Clara sat near the small window with a thermos of tea and an expression that mixed triumph and exhaustion. She had constructed a hidden chamber in her basement years ago to store preserves and old furniture. It became a refuge on that night. I took in the low ceiling and the makeshift bed, and then remembered with a rush the reason for all of this. I was alive, and they thought I was dead. Clara had installed cameras in my house before the staged collapse. She had not told me everything. As I sat up, she opened her laptop and showed me images that made my stomach drop and my face burn with a cold shame. The footage revealed how swiftly they had moved. My family arrived at the house with more urgency than sorrow. They entered like prospectors, seizing an opportunity. They did not kneel, they did not lament. They opened drawers with greedy fingers, they sifted through papers, they measured the layout of the house as if planning renovations. Patricia, my former sister-in-law, tossed an old family photograph into the trash without hesitation. Tomas rifled through the desk until he found bank statements, his mouth forming a greedy smile as he read numbers aloud. Marco paced through rooms, making a list of items to sell, while Isabella took pictures of the balcony and the view, already imagining the buyers who would pay for its panorama. The sight of them treating my life like a ledger of assets made bile rise in my throat. I had expected disappointment, cruelty even, but the speed and the cold efficiency of their actions shocked me beyond words. It was as if they had practiced these moves in secret for months. The recordings captured them laughing at jokes about how quickly they could move a sale about the convenience of a cremation with no wake. Their voices were light, almost cheerful, as if they were discussing an ordinary purchase rather than the aftermath of my supposed death. I watched and listened from that cellar as they divided possessions like a business meeting. I listened to Marco coordinate with real estate agents and insurance contacts while his face showed none of the grief I knew a son should feel. Clara sat beside me holding my hand when my fingers trembled. We had gained the proof we needed, but the victory felt strange and incomplete. I had exposed their intent, but I had not yet forced the consequences upon them. The world did not yet know what I had seen. The court of public opinion had not spoken. As the hours passed, I realized that the next step required a bolder move. The evidence was damning, but evidence alone would not guarantee justice. We needed witnesses beyond the hidden cameras. We needed someone with reach, someone who could make the story loud enough to drown their lies. Clara looked at me with a quiet question in her eyes. I understood then what she was thinking. We would have to make my return public, and we would have to do it in a way that left them no room for escape. The plan that had begun as a desperate tactic had evolved into a strategy for exposure. We had to choose the moment carefully. They would gather to divide the spoils when they believed the estate was ready for distribution. That meeting would be the perfect stage. If I could appear at that precise moment with cameras and with legal witnesses, their faces would be captured for all to see. The thought filled me with a fierce, terrible exhilaration. We set to work on the next piece of the plan, the part that would transform proof into punishment and secrecy into a spectacle that none of them would survive. The night after watching my family divide my belongings like vultures, I knew hesitation would only feed their cruelty. I had already staged my death, but that was only the beginning. Proof alone was not enough. Their greed had to be shown to the world, revealed under a light so bright they could never crawl back into shadows. For that, I needed allies beyond Clara and Dr. Velasco. I needed someone who could carry my story into every living room, every newspaper, every phone screen. Someone who would not let them twist the narrative. Clara knew exactly who that person was. Her eyes glimmered with a rare spark of mischief as she whispered the name. Valeria Cruz. She was a journalist with a reputation for chasing scandals until they cracked open no matter who tried to silence her. People feared her determination as much as they respected it. If we could convince Valeria to take on my case, then Marco, Isabella, Tomas, and Lucia would never escape their own words. The meeting took place late at night in Clara's living room. The curtains were drawn tight and the lamps were dimmed, so no one passing by would notice. Valeria arrived with a small camera slung over her shoulder and the wary expression of a woman who had seen too many lies. I expected doubt, even mockery, but as soon as Clara and I showed her the recordings, her face changed. Her eyes widened, her lips tightened, and she leaned forward like a predator catching the scent of prey. "This," she said at last, her voice low and deliberate, "is bigger than anything I have handled in years. A family plotting the death of their own mother, covering it as an accident, then laughing over her belongings. This is not only a crime, this is a revelation of what greed can do to blood." Her words burned into me, but they also steadied my resolve. She believed me. More importantly, she was willing to act. Together we devised a plan that was equal parts justice and theater. If they wanted to turn my life into a stage for their greed, then I would use that same stage to expose them. The inheritance meeting would be the perfect moment. Marco had already spoken of it, and I knew he would gather the others soon to formalize their scheme. Valeria promised to bring her camera crew, and Clara coordinated with the local police, ensuring officers would be ready to arrest them on the spot. Dr. Velasco agreed to appear, if needed, prepared to testify that my death had been staged for my protection. Every piece of the puzzle slid into place, forming a picture more powerful than I had ever dared to imagine. But plans alone did not erase fear. The nights leading up to that day were long and sleepless. I lay awake in Clara's cellar, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant lap of waves against the cliffs. Doubts whispered in my mind. What if something went wrong? What if the cameras malfunctioned or the police arrived too late? What if Marco attacked me in desperation? I turned these thoughts over like stones in my hand, feeling their weight but refusing to let them bury to me. On the morning of the chosen day, Clara helped me prepare. I slipped into the red dress I had bought years earlier for Marco's wedding, a dress that symbolized both sacrifice and misplaced pride. I curled my hair and dabbed on makeup with trembling hands. If I was going to rise from the dead, I wanted to look radiant, untouchable, a woman reborn from betrayal. Clara adjusted my necklace, her eyes shining with pride and fear all at once. By early afternoon, Valeria arrived with 2 cameramen and a sound technician. They set up discreetly in Clara's living room, testing microphones, checking lenses, preparing for the spectacle that would soon unfold. The police officers who joined us spoke little, but their presence brought a sense of finality. This was no longer a plan whispered in secrecy. It was a mission moments away from execution. Through the hidden cameras in my home, we watched my family gather. Marco sat in my favorite chair, the same one where I used to cradle him when he was a child. Isabella perched beside him, her posture elegant but her eyes sharp with greed. Tomas and Lucia settled on the sofa, already bickering softly over imagined shares of money. On the table lay a folder filled with financial documents. Marco had collected proof of his careful planning. I felt my heart hammer in my chest as I watched them. My fingers curled around the key to my front door, slick with sweat. This was the moment. Valeria touched my shoulder lightly, giving me the final cue. "We are live," she whispered. I drew a breath so deep it seemed to scrape my lungs raw. Then I stepped into the fading daylight, walked across the short stretch of road, and turned my key in the lock. The sound echoed through the house. Inside, the conversation ceased abruptly. Silence pressed against the walls like a storm waiting to break. When I pushed the door open, the scene froze in time. 4 pairs of eyes widened in disbelief. Isabella's mouth opened in a scream that curdled into silence. Marco leapt to his feet, knocking the folder of papers to the floor. Tomas paled, his hands trembling, while Lucia clutched her purse to her chest as though it might shield her from ghosts. I stood in the doorway, framed by the red of my dress and the glow of the cameras behind me. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt inside. "Hello, my dear family. I hope I am not interrupting anything important." Valeria stepped in after me, announcing herself and the live broadcast. Her words sliced through the room like knives. "We are here today to reveal the truth about a conspiracy, one of the most shocking betrayals imaginable. And it begins with the woman you thought was dead." The air quivered with panic. Marco stammered denials. Isabella shook her head furiously, her eyes wild. Tomas muttered about tricks while Lucia whimpered about ghosts. But their voices could not drown out the recordings Valeria played next. Their own words filled the air, cruel, calculated, undeniable. I watched their faces crumble as the truth consumed them. Isabella covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks, but not from remorse, only from fear. Marco turned toward me, his eyes desperate, searching for the mother who might once have forgiven him. But she was gone. In her place stood a woman reborn by betrayal, armed with proof, justice, and the strength of survival. The officers stepped forward, their voices clear and commanding. One by one, they placed cuffs on the wrists of my conspirators. The sound of metal closing around them was the sweetest music I had ever heard. My family had planned to bury me in silence, but instead it was their own lies that were being buried under the weight of truth. As they were led away, the camera captured every detail, every tremor of their faces, every tear, and every curse. I stood tall, watching them disappear into the arms of justice, but inside I knew this was not the end. The trial awaited. Their attempts to twist the story to paint themselves as victims would soon begin, and I would need every ounce of strength I had left to face what came next. The image of my family in handcuffs should have brought me peace, but it did not. As the police led them out of my house, their voices tangled in a storm of excuses and accusations. Marco shouted that the recordings were fake. Isabella wailed that she had been manipulated. Tomas tried to blame everyone else, and Lucia whimpered about being misunderstood. Yet the cameras caught everything. Their faces twisted in panic, their words spilling over each other, all broadcast live into living rooms across the city. I stood in the center of the chaos, my body trembling but my voice steady. Valeria kept her camera trained on me as I looked straight into the lens. "This," I said, "is what greed does to a family." They wanted my house, my savings, and my life insurance. But what they forgot is that the truth always finds its way to the surface. The officers paused for a moment, giving the audience one last glimpse of the family that had plotted my death. Then they pushed them out the door, their protests fading into the night. The following hours were a blur. Valeria's crew packed their equipment with the efficiency of people who had seen scandals unfold before, but even they admitted that nothing compared to this. Clara held my hand as though afraid I might vanish again. And outside neighbors had begun to gather, whispering and pointing their eyes wide with disbelief. By dawn, my name was already on every headline. Mother returns from the dead to expose family murder plot. Greed unmasked in coastal town. The Navarro conspiracy. The days that followed were nothing short of madness. Reporters swarmed the streets, cameras flashed, and my phone rang until I unplugged it. Strangers left flowers at my gate, some out of sympathy, others because they saw me as a symbol of survival. Letters arrived from women I had never met, mothers who confessed that their children had abandoned them, that their sacrifices had been forgotten. My story had awakened something deep and raw in thousands of people, and it frightened me as much as it humbled me. But for my family, the nightmare was only beginning. The prosecutor's office wasted no time. With the recordings, the hidden camera footage, and the broadcast that had captured their every denial, the case against them was overwhelming. Still, I knew they would fight back. People like Marco and Isabella would not go quietly. They would twist, they would lie, they would claw at every shadow if it gave them a chance to escape judgment. The first hearing was crowded. Journalists filled the benches, sketch artists hunched over their pads, and curious citizens pressed close to the doors. When Marco entered, he wore a suit as though the fabric could restore his dignity. Isabella followed in a pale dress, her makeup carefully chosen to make her look fragile. Tomas walked stiffly, his jaw tight, while Lucia lowered her eyes and clutched her rosary beads as though faith could erase her cruelty. Their lawyers worked quickly, spinning a tale that tried to transform the narrative. They painted me as a controlling mother, a woman who had used guilt as a weapon. They claimed Marco had been suffocated by my expectations, that Isabella had been caught in the storm of a manipulative family feud, that Tomas and Lucia had been victims of my arrogance. They argued that the recordings were taken out of context, that the hidden cameras violated privacy, that the broadcast was nothing more than a spectacle designed to humiliate them. As I sat listening, my stomach churned. It was one thing to know they had plotted my death. It was another to hear them twist my love into poison, to watch them try to paint me as the villain. But when it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, steadied myself, and told the court my truth. I spoke of the nights I had gone without food so Marco could eat. I spoke of the ring I had sold to buy his computer, of the 14-hour days I had worked to keep him in school. I told them how I had begged Tomas for help and been turned away, how I had endured insults and cold shoulders to see Marco reach his dreams. My voice broke at times, but I did not falter. I wanted the jury to feel every sacrifice, every scar carved into my hands by years of labor. The prosecutor then played the recordings. First, the conversation in the SUV. The words rang through the courtroom, clear and merciless. "The plan is perfect. It will look like a tragic accident." Gasps rippled through the benches as the voices of Marco and Isabella filled the air. Then came the hidden camera footage from my house, the images of them rifling through my drawers, laughing about quick cremation, throwing away family photographs. By the time it ended, silence had descended on the room, the kind of silence that presses heavy on every chest. The jury members shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale. Even the judge took a moment before clearing his throat to proceed. Marco buried his face in his hands. Isabella wept into a tissue, though I could not tell if it was grief or fear. Tomas sat rigid, his lips pressed together, while Lucia muttered prayers under her breath. The trial stretched for weeks each day, peeling back more layers of deceit. Their financial records revealed crushing debts, proof that desperation had driven them to madness. Witnesses testified about overheard conversations, about their sudden questions regarding my life insurance. Piece by piece, the story of their conspiracy solidified until it was unshakable. Yet what struck me most during those long days was not their lies or their fear. It was the realization that they had once been my family. I had laughed with them at dinners, shared holidays, believed in their affection, and now they sat before me as strangers bound by greed, stripped of love. When the verdict finally came, the tension in the room was unbearable. The foreman of the jury rose, his voice steady. "Guilty on all counts. The words struck like a bell, final and undeniable. Sentences were read out one by one. Marco, 25 years. Isabella, 18 years. Tomas, 15 years. Lucia, 12 years. As the gavel came down, I felt the weight of justice settle over us all. But justice, I realized, was not the same as peace. As they were led away, Marco turned once, his eyes meeting mine. For a fleeting second, I saw the boy. He had been the child who used to fall asleep against my chest. His lips formed words I could not hear, and then he was gone, swallowed by the system that would keep him far from me. That night I walked through my house in silence. The furniture, the walls, the balcony, all seemed haunted by ghosts of love and betrayal. I knew I could not stay. This place, once my sanctuary, had become a monument to treachery. I would need to leave it behind if I was to begin again. Still, as I stood on that balcony overlooking the endless sea, I felt something I had not felt in years. Strength. They had tried to destroy me, but instead they had forced me to rise. And though the trial was over, my story was only just beginning. By the time the sun slid behind the roofs and turned the street, a bruised gold, everything was in position. The cameras were live. The officers waited a short walk away. Valeria checked her crew with the calm of a surgeon. Clara steadied me with a look that said we had already come too far to turn back. On the monitor, my living room glowed under the lamps. Marco sat where I used to read him stories. Isabella crossed her legs like a queen holding court. Tomas and Lucia leaned over a folder, whispering over numbers that did not belong to them. I pressed the key into my palm until it left a crescent mark on my skin. The house I had loved would become a stage. I told myself that stages are only rooms with brighter lights. I told myself that grief would not lead tonight. Truth would. When Valeria lifted 2 fingers, I stepped out with my head high and my breath held tight. The door gave a soft click. Silence rippled through the house as if the walls understood before anyone inside did. I stood in the doorway and let them see me. For a heartbeat, we were statues. Then the room shattered. Isabella pushed back so fast her chair scraped and fell. Tomas grabbed at the table and missed. Lucia made the sound of a prayer and a plea at once. Marco found his voice first and tried to gather the moment into something he could control. He failed. I did not speak, not yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of my presence before I gave them the mercy of my words. Valeria stepped to my shoulder and announced that the city was watching. The red lights on the cameras burned like patient stars. The officers held their place in the hall, out of frame, but close enough for the air to change. Marco reached for performance. He said this was a mistake. He said someone had tricked us all. He said I had been confused, that grief and age had clouded my mind. He reached for the boy he once had been and tried to wear him like a mask, but the mask slid. The red lights do not lie. The cameras had already seen too much. Valeria lifted a hand, and the first recording played. The garage returned cold and echoing. My son spoke of an accident that would look natural. Isabella counted insurance and property like a ledger in a calm voice. They named the balcony. They named my age. They named the way a body falls and the way a story sounds when you want it to be believed. The room listened to itself and could not bear the sound. The second clip followed. Hidden cameras scattered through my home, all the ordinary places where life had lived and lingered. Tomas pulling open drawers with greedy hands. Lucia holding jewelry to the light and dismissing it with a curl of the lip. Isabella suggesting a fast cremation to save money and to save face. Marco calling an agent to list a house he did not own. They looked at my life the way scavengers look at a shoreline after a storm. The footage did not blink or soften. When the audio stopped, the silence was deeper than before. Even the lamp seemed to hum in shock. Isabella started to cry with the flair of an actress at the end of a scene. Tomas tried anger. Lucia tried pity. Marco tried reason. But the room had changed hands. It belonged to the truth now. Only then did I speak. I told them they had mistaken my love for weakness. I told them they had mistaken their planning for power. I told them that the world does not always turn away when cruelty happens behind closed doors. My voice did not shake. I had already lost too much to give them my fear. Valeria asked me what it felt like to stand in the room where they had divided me into items and sums. It felt, I said, like the sea after a storm. Debris everywhere, the air full of salt and judgment, but also a clear horizon if I kept my eyes open. She turned her microphone to the 4 people who had set out to erase me. Their answers stumbled over each other and fell. The officers stepped into the scene without haste. They had waited until the last image had done its work. When they read the charges, the words were calm and plain. Conspiracy. Attempted homicide. Insurance fraud. Their calm made the moment heavier than shouting ever could. Metal touched wrists. Breath grew short. The house that was once my shelter and then my prison became a witness. As they moved to the door, Isabella looked at the balcony as if it were an accomplice that had failed her. Thomas stared at the floor as if numbers might crawl up and save him. Lucia clutched a rosary that had not been there when she laughed over the cost of grief. Marco turned to me and searched my face for a mother who could still forgive. I could feel the history of his childhood in that look, the small hand in mine, the feverish nights. The empty plate set in front of him and the full one kept for me that I always pushed his way. He tried to summon that past into the present and hold it between us like a shield. It did not come. The night outside was dense and watching. Neighbors stood in shadow. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, then fell quiet, as if it too understood this was not a night for noise. Valeria closed the segment with a voice that was steady but bright with heat. She said the city had seen enough to ask hard questions. She said more would come. She said this was the kind of story that forces a mirror into a family hand. When the door shut and the sirens left, the house exhaled. Clara came in and wrapped her arms around me. I did not cry. My eyes had no tears left to spend. We sat together on the edge of the sofa and looked at the folder Marco had dropped. Numbers, names, plans, the map of a future they almost wrote in my blood. Valeria packed her gear, then paused and asked if I was ready for what would follow. Trials are long, she said. People get desperate when the lights go off. I nodded. I had lived years inside a longer trial than any courtroom could hold. That night I walked through each room with a slow and careful step, the rugs, the windows, the kitchen chair with the small dent where I always rested my elbow. I half expected the house to speak. Instead it listened. It seemed to ask whether I would stay or whether I would leave, and I told it that some homes are bridges. They take you over the darkest water and then ask to be let go. I slept for an hour at dawn and woke with the sound of waves in my ears, though there were none at this hour and this tide. It was memory and nerves. It was also the sea inside me quieting at last. Breakfast tasted like something earned. When the phone started to ring again, Valeria answered for me and said there would be a statement later. She was kind enough to let the morning grow legs under me. By afternoon, the city had chosen sides. Some sent flowers. Some sent messages that began with disbelief and ended with a confession. A few sent anger as if my survival had embarrassed them. Clara sorted the notes into piles and kept the cruel words out of my hands. She told me that the important ones were simple. I believe you. I am proud of you. I thought I was alone. At dusk, the prosecutor called. The case would move quickly, he said. The recordings had the weight of stone. The hidden footage built a road the defense would find hard to leave. He warned me that they would try nonetheless. They would paint me as cold. They would say I had manipulated the stage. They would call me dramatic. I told him that I had been dramatic to remain alive. He laughed softly, not unkindly, and said that truth can be dramatic when it refuses to kneel. I stood at the window after the call and watched the street lamps rise. Somewhere beyond the dark rooftops, a courtroom waited. I could see the benches. I could hear the scrape of chairs and the low hum of voices. I could picture the moment when the first question would rise and try to swallow the truth I had carried this far. I did not flinch from that image. Night settled like ink and did not thin. I set out the dress I would wear, not the red one, not a color of spectacle, a quiet blue that looked like morning. I placed my hands flat on the table and promised myself that I would answer every question with the same calm I had used at my own front door. The city had seen the resurrection. Now it would see what comes after. The clock moved. The house breathed. Somewhere chains rattled against bars and plans were rewritten. I turned off the last lamp and felt the dark hold steady around me. Morning would bring judgment. But whose judgment it would be, and how sharp that was a story still waiting to be told. The courthouse stood on a hill above the city, its stone steps worn by decades of footsteps. On the morning of the trial, I walked up those steps slowly, my hands folded in front of me, the quiet blue dress brushing against my ankles. I felt the weight of eyes all around. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their cameras already raised. Strangers whispered my name as though it belonged to a character from a story and not a living woman walking past them. I held my head high and did not look away. Inside, the air was heavy with murmurs. Journalists filled the benches, their pens poised. Neighbors from my village sat stiffly in the back rows, their faces pale with curiosity and unease. At the front, the judge entered with a firm step, his robe sweeping the floor. The bailiff called for silence, and the room stilled as though the world itself had paused. When Marco entered, I almost forgot to breathe. He wore a dark suit pressed sharp as if fabric could erase what he had done. His face was pale, but his eyes darted with defiance. Behind him came Isabella, draped in soft colors that made her look fragile. Tomas followed, his jaw tight, his eyes stubborn. Lucia clutched a rosary so tightly her knuckles whitened. For a moment, I saw them as a family again, but only in shape. In truth, they were strangers now, bound not by love, but by a conspiracy that had unraveled too soon. Their lawyers wasted no time. They spoke with the smoothness of men used to bending words into shields. They painted me as controlling, overbearing, a mother who had never allowed her son to live freely. They claimed Marco had been desperate, manipulated by a mother who held her sacrifices like chains. Isabella, they said, was guilty only of loyalty to her husband. Tomas and Lucia, they argued, had been swept up in resentment but never intended harm. Each lawyer bowed and gestured with hands that sliced the air, weaving a story meant to cast me as the villain. I listened in silence, my hands folded, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Their words cut deep, but not as deep as the betrayal itself had cut. I reminded myself that truth has a voice stronger than argument, and soon that voice would speak. When the prosecutor rose, the tone of the room shifted. He began with the recordings, the ones captured in the SUV. Marco's voice filled the courtroom, calm and certain, speaking of a fall from a balcony, of an accident no one would question. Isabella's voice followed, counting the money, speaking of insurance and property, as though lives were numbers on a page. Gasps rippled across the benches. The judge's face hardened, his pen scratching notes furiously. Then came the footage from the hidden cameras in my house. The jury watched as my brother pulled open drawers, as his wife sneered at jewelry, as Isabella mocked me as a ghost long before I had died. The image of Marco calling an agent to list my house was the final stroke. Even the defense lawyers shifted uneasily in their chairs. When it was my turn to testify, I rose with slow steadiness. I spoke of the years of work, of selling my wedding ring to buy Marco a computer, of 14-hour days that left my body broken but my spirit unyielding. I told them how I had begged Tomas for help and been turned away. I described the night in the garage when I had hidden behind a seat and overheard my death planned in cold voices. I told them how I had chosen to fight back, not with violence, but with truth, with evidence, with light. My voice wavered at times, but I did not falter. I wanted the jury to hear not only the facts, but the pain beneath them. I wanted them to feel the years of sacrifice, the sting of betrayal, and the weight of survival. By the time I finished, the silence in the room was thick enough to press against my skin. The defense tried to counter. Marco himself took the stand. His eyes filled with tears as he spoke. He said he had never meant to hurt me, that the conversations were only venting, that he had been under financial stress. He swore that he loved me, that he had always loved me. His words trembled with desperation, but I saw through them. They were not the words of a repentant son. They were the words of a man drowning, grasping at anything that might keep him above water. Isabella's turn followed. She played the role of the dutiful wife, claiming she had only echoed Marco's fears, that she had never truly believed the plan would be carried out. Tomas and Lucia painted themselves as desperate, angry at life, manipulated into words they did not mean. Their performances were polished, but the recordings had already told the truer story. When the closing arguments ended, the jury disappeared into their chamber. Hours stretched into a silence that scraped at the nerves of everyone present. I sat still, my hands clasped my lips, whispering no prayers but only steady breaths. Clara sat behind me, her hand on my shoulder, grounding me like a stone in rushing water. At last the jury returned. The foreman rose, his voice clear and steady. Guilty on all counts. The words fell into the room like a hammer striking metal. The air quivered, then released in a rush of whispers. The judge confirmed the verdicts, his voice measured but firm. The sentences were read aloud. Marco, 25 years in prison. Isabella, 18 years. Tomas, 15 years. Lucia, 12 years. Each name, each number was like a closing door. I watched their faces. Marco's defiance cracked into despair. Isabella's fragility shattered into bitterness. Tomas clenched his jaw until his lips trembled. Lucia clutched her rosary tighter, but even faith could not soften the weight of chains. As they were led away, Marco turned once more. His eyes met mine, and for an instant I saw the boy he had been. The boy who used to fall asleep in my lap after long days. The boy who once whispered that he wanted to make me proud. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words I could not hear. Then he was gone, swallowed by the system that had once seemed built only for others. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters swarmed outside, their voices calling questions that I did not answer. Clara guided me past them, her arm steady against mine. The world had seen the verdict. Justice had spoken. But justice does not always bring peace. That night I stood in my garden, the small one in the village, where the soil was fresh and unburdened. I looked up at the stars scattered across the black like shards of glass. My life had been broken, but the pieces now formed a new pattern. Sharper, stronger, unafraid. The past would never vanish. The scars would never fade, but they no longer ruled me. The trial was over, and so was the story my family had tried to write. But mine was not over. Mine had only just begun. When the trial ended, and the courthouse emptied, the world outside still pulsed with noise. Journalists filled the steps, microphones reached out like hands, and strangers craned their necks to glimpse me. I did not stop to answer. The verdict had already spoken for me. I let Clara guide me through the crowd, her hand firm on my arm, and together we walked past the flashing cameras into the calm of a waiting car. The ride back to my village was quiet. I stared out the window at the streets flashing by, the faces of people who now knew my name but not my soul. My story had become theirs, carried through newspapers, television, and endless whispers. But for me, the story was not a headline. It was a scar carved deep and still tender. That night I stepped into my small garden and inhaled the scent of lavender and damp earth. The stars were scattered wide, sharp against the sky. For the first time in many months I did not feel hunted. The danger was gone, locked behind bars where it belonged. Yet peace did not come as easily as I had imagined. Peace, I realized, was something you build, not something you receive at the stroke of a gavel. I sold the cliffside house where betrayal had taken root. Its walls were heavy with ghosts, its balcony haunted by a plan that had nearly succeeded. With the money, I strengthened my scholarship fund for single mothers. I wanted my suffering to bloom into hope for others. If my sacrifices had nearly ended my life, then perhaps those sacrifices could now extend the lives of others. I wanted no child to lose a chance at education because a mother had too little in her hands. Messages poured in from strangers. Some praised my courage. Others shared their own wounds, their own betrayals. A woman wrote that her children had left her in a nursing home and never returned. A man confessed that his brother had stolen from him and destroyed their bond. A grandmother whispered through her letter that she had raised her grandchildren only to be abandoned once they no longer needed her. Each letter was a mirror reflecting pain, but also a bridge connecting us. I built a circle of these voices. We called ourselves a chosen family. We met in community halls, in gardens, in kitchens filled with the scent of coffee and bread. We laughed together, cried together, and healed together. We celebrated small victories and held each other through losses. For the first time in decades, I felt what family was meant to be. Among them was Gabrielle, a woman whose story echoed mine with haunting precision. Her daughter had taken everything and left her behind. The two of us became inseparable. We cooked together, tended gardens side by side, and leaned on each other when the nights grew long. She became the sister I had never truly had, and in her company the bitterness inside me softened. 2 years passed. My hair grew whiter, my hands more wrinkled, but my heart lighter. I was no longer the woman who crouched in terror behind a car seat listening to the sound of her own death plotted by those she loved most. I was a survivor, a teacher once again, though my lessons now were not about books but about resilience. Then one day a letter arrived from prison. The handwriting was rough, uneven but familiar. Marco. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it. Inside were 4 pages of apologies, confessions, and sorrow. He spoke of therapy sessions of sleepless nights haunted by my sacrifices. He admitted his greed, his blindness, his shame. He said he remembered the boy he used to be, the one who had clung to me with trust and love, and he hated the man he had become. I read the letter over and over. My heart twisted with pain, and something else I could not name. At last I wrote back. I told him I accepted his apology, but forgiveness was not something a single letter could win. Forgiveness was a path he would have to walk for years, perhaps for the rest of his life. I told him the boy I had raised still lived inside him, but only he could decide if that boy was worth finding again. I never received another reply, and I learned to be at peace with that silence. Now at 65, I look around me and see life where once I saw only loss. My garden blooms with roses and marigolds. My scholarship fund helps young mothers send their children to school. My chosen family fills my home with laughter and warmth. I am no longer defined by betrayal, but by what I have built from its ashes. Sometimes people ask if I regret faking my death, if I wish I had chosen another path. My answer is always the same. They chose to plan my death in the most dramatic way possible. I chose to survive with equal drama. I did not only fake my death, I faked my rebirth, and I am proud of that choice. Because in the end, true family is not the blood we are born with. True family is the love we choose, the loyalty that cannot be bought, the hands that lift us when the world tries to drag us down. And as I sit tonight under the glow of the setting sun, my hands deep in the soil of my garden, I know one truth above all. They tried to bury me, but they did not know I was a seed. This story is about betrayal, sacrifice, and rebirth. It shows how greed can poison even the deepest bonds, but also how resilience can turn pain into strength. It reminds us that true family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we create through love, loyalty, and kindness. Most of all, it teaches us that even in the darkest moments, we hold the power to choose life, hope, and renewal. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with others who may need its message, and leave a comment telling me what part touched you most. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and I cannot wait to share the next journey with you.